Now, the EU's deforestation regulation demands that products exported to the region are deforestation-free or will be banned as of January next year. This includes a number of soft commodities, many of which come from African plantations where deforestation or forest degradation has taken place. Cameroon, for one, has raised concerns about preparedness for the economic consequences of the regulation. Theo Klein, economist at Oxford Economics Africa, joins us with more insight. Thank you so much for your time, Theo. Now, actually talk to us about the reliance of Africa's agricultural sector on deforestation.
Yes, so look, Europe is a major export destination for most African countries, specifically when it comes to soft or agricultural commodities. And this EU deforestation regulation targets 7 specific agricultural products, which Africa is a major producer of in various countries. And so this certainly will be a negative impact for Africa if strictly enforced come January 2025.
Yeah. Well, talk to me then about Europe's reliance on the African agricultural sector. And I mean, if we don't comply, are there alternative markets that the EU can actually go to where it would cost us a lot as Africa?
Yes. So look, with some commodities, there certainly are alternative markets where they can source it from, but with others, definitely not. So the 7 commodities that they target with this regulation is things like rubber, soy, cattle, palm oil, timber, and then cocoa and coffee. So, with things like cattle, for example, yes, some southern African countries export a lot of that to the EU, but the EU can get it from other countries, but not some for coffee and cocoa, for example. If we look at some of the West African countries that produce cocoa, such as Ivory Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon, they supply over 75% of the global cocoa supplies.
Yeah.
So certainly Europe will not be able to easily get cocoa from elsewhere if it's not from these West African countries.
Yeah.
With things like coffee, for example, there we know that East African countries like Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and Ethiopia are major exporters of coffee, but then they're not the biggest globally. There we know that Latin American or South American countries are the biggest exporters of coffee. If I remember correctly, East Africa only supplies about 6 to 8% of the EU's coffee. But then of about 70 to 80% of the EU's cocoa comes from West African countries. So if we are non-compliant by January 2025, they will definitely find it very difficult to source cocoa from other markets, and that will actually negatively impact European companies who, make sweets and chocolates from those cocoa beans.
Well, talk to me about the timelines here that the EU has set, because as I mentioned in the intro, Cameroon says that it's just not ready for that right now. And actually what, these African countries then are supposed to do between now and the time when the expiry date comes through.
Yes. Look, so in talking about Cameroon in specific, they have actually put a plan in place since January 2021 to target deforestation-free cocoa production by the end of 2025. However, regardless of all the efforts that they've done up until now, if we look at the numbers at January this year, we see that they've only surveyed about 25,000 cocoa farmers out of an estimated 300,000 cocoa farmers in Cameroon. So that's only about 8% of farmers that they've actually surveyed. So, a lot of work still remains to be done. This EU regulation has been coming on for the last couple of years, but it only really came into force in June last year.
Yeah.
So I think the deadline of January next year is very tight and very ambitious for African countries who don't always have the financial resources to comply with the different requirements. So I think January 2025 is very ambitious. I think it definitely needs to be delayed, and various countries have actually asked EU officials to postpone the deadline. The EU has been sort of graceful to small farmers in Africa, but your bigger companies, they still have the deadline of January next year. So it still remains to be seen whether they actually stick to that. My suspicion is that it will have to be postponed because most African countries, especially Cameroon, is just not ready for January. And I think the EU will definitely shoot themselves in the foot if they don't actually postpone the deadline.
Can smaller farmers in particularly sustainably move away from deforestation?
Look, so the thing is, their farms are already there. So whether they cut trees off a few years ago and cleared a forest to have their farm there,
Yeah.
the farm is there, but they need to also adhere to other rules in this. That's part of this regulation to say, but we adhere to basic labor and human rights. So we don't employ children on our farms, for example. They need to also provide evidence that they actually engage with biodiversity conservation and also environmental protection. And they need to then also ensure that if they expand their farms going forward, as these small farmers want to become bigger, they then need to provide evidence that they do not engage in forest or deforestation or forest degradation in order to expand their farms. So it certainly will make things or life a lot tougher for small farmers.
Yeah.
And we do question whether they have the financial resources to do it. I don't think so. I think they will, to a large extent, need financial support from European companies or regulators to assist them to have all the digital monitoring systems put in place because they need to trace, provide a geographical location of their farm. They need to trace their cocoa beans from their farm all the way to export to the export destination. So that involves these small farmers having to collect information on their suppliers, their wholesalers, the export agents, and so forth, to provide the EU regulators with evidence of where the cocoa beans come from, the date that it was produced, the time that it took, up until the point where it's exported to the EU. And I just don't, that will significantly push up their production costs, which I don't see most of them being able to pay themselves. So definitely either assistance from their local government or EU regulators would be needed.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for giving us insight on that. We do have to wrap up this very, very interesting conversation, Theo. And of course, we'll be looking out for the developments on that side and maybe an opportunity for agri-tech players to go in there as they try to kind of boost the geo-mapping efforts on that front. Thank you so much for your time. That was Theo Klein, economist at Oxford Economics Africa.